Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversation. I'm Dr. Terry Jackson, and I have with me Dr. Philip Brown. We are at the intersection. What's interesting is we all experience many intersections daily. We experience intersections at church, at home, at work, and at play. How we handle those intersections will choose or determine the trajectory of our day and our life. Good morning, Dr. Brown. How are you?
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Very excited about today's topic. Full commitment.
That's right. Full commitment. All in.
What's that mean to you?
Oh, that's a great question. What's it? It means mind, body, soul, and spirit into everything that I do, giving it my 100% all, as we call it. You know, being an athlete or former athlete, some people can't tell that I was a former athlete. Football, basketball, and baseball, being committed to being the best that you could actually be, right? What you're doing the workouts, studying in the off season, studying the competition, even from an academic perspective, right? Commitment to those courses that were our favorite courses, right? For me, commitment was extremely important, right? Trying to become who I thought I wanted to become, right? Took full commitment. So it's an interesting topic. I'm looking to delve more into it. And what's of interest to me is what determines what you commit to?
Wow, that's deep. And just the whole concept that you described has so many elements.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like folks commonly forget about some of those preparation type elements.
Absolutely. And that's the key to being able to commit, right? Why would you commit to anything that you haven't prepared to do, you haven't prepared to commit to, right? By studying the landscape of whatever it is, right? It could be something as simple as preparing to read a book, doing a little bit of research and figuring out, why should I commit to reading this book? How is it going to help me along the way? What knowledge will I get out of it? How will it impact my life? As we talk about intent and impact here, there has to be intent. And making a commitment is truly about intent and impact.
Sounds like you're talking about context for that commitment.
Yes, absolutely.
And as we say, a lot of times context is decisive. So it's where we start has a lot to do with where we finish.
That's
many
right.
times, if not every time.
Yep, absolutely. Committing to education, right? Whether we liked it or not, we committed to it when our mothers enrolled us in the first grade. But there was a 12-year commitment, right? Some may have gone a little shorter, some may have gone a little longer, but commitment runs in every aspect of our life, whether we know it or not, whether we want to recommend it or not. And what I like about commitment is this other phrase that comes along with it, right? You're either all in or you're not in at all. There's no halfway, right? It's like I heard the statement: you can't be half pregnant, right? You either are or you're not, right? So that's the power of commitment. And so, if I had to take a look at commitment, how do we measure how committed we are to a particular subject or topic or way of life?
That's a tough question. It's on the inside, and it makes me also think, one of the things you mentioned earlier was a big part of it is doing your best. And we know your best is not the same every day,
That's
right?
right.
Like
That's
some
right.
days your best is just way better.
That's right.
And other days. So how do you reconcile those days when your best isn't quite as good as you want it to be, but still count that thing as a day of full commitment because the effort was there?
That's right. Absolutely. And that's a key point you just made. Even though we're committed and we're doing our best, my Monday may not be as good as my Tuesday. And my Wednesday may be better than my Tuesday. But as long as I gave it my best that particular day. Tell you a story. As my daughter was coming along through grade school and high school, and maybe she didn't do as well on a particular test. I wouldn't kind of fuss at her, if you would. I would look at the test, I would look at the grade, and then I would ask her this question: was this your best? Then I would ask the next question: if you had to take it again, knowing what you know now, would you do better? And she would say yes, and that would be it. I would leave it alone, because everyone knows when they're not doing their very best, right? Even though it may have been the best that day, but it may not have been the very best that they've ever done or that they can do, and that's the key to commitment.
That whole idea that perfection is hard to attain, and I can't tell you how many times I know my daughter has come home from a test and she'll talk about the thing that she knew that she just missed for whatever reason. And it always comes down to, this kind of reminds me of our friend Dr. Rao, that process focus. Can't always control the outcomes, right? You've temporarily lost your mind, missed a game-winning layup, or missed an easy question on a test or something of that nature. Distraction happens. It is foundational to where we are now, more so than ever, with the income and stimuli that we get, and especially kids get these days. But that focus on process, and really that relentless focus day in and day out on that process, to me is one real measure of commitment.
You know, Dr. Brown, you being a physician, and more importantly, being a surgeon, that took commitment. I don't know how many years of education you've had to go through after undergraduate, but there was a commitment, and you knew that there was going to be delayed gratification because of the process. Talk to us about your commitment, because I think you told me when you first were admitted into med school, they didn't have room for you, but you were willing to sleep in your truck to make it happen.
I got in so late, right? It was like I didn't know if I was going to find a place to live or not.
Right.
But, I said, hey, yeah, I'm still willing to come. It turns out I did find a place to sleep. It all worked out. I made it through. It was 11 years of training after undergraduate school. And it was that commitment over time. There are better days and there are worse days, and you set yourself up on that pathway of delayed gratification. You have to, and then you just break it down into small pieces. What does it take to get to the next step? A lot of times you don't even know. So in my particular case, when I first went into medical school, I vividly remember walking into the back of that Brody building. It was the exact color of a boiled shrimp coming from the coast. I was like, boy, this is an ugly building, right? 4 quick years, I'll be out of here. It ended up actually 13 years later, because I did a little bit of time on faculty at East Carolina after I finished. And it was a function of, I didn't know what I didn't know when I started, right? Like, I knew there was training after medical school, but I didn't know the rigors that were going to ultimately be involved in all of that, right? But I knew I was committed to get through it. I definitely didn't want to do surgery because I knew it was too long of a residency, and I felt like I was a little bit older starting, so I was in a hurry, but it kind of selected me. And then I certainly didn't want to do any additional training, but vascular surgery selected me, and so I ended up pursuing what ultimately interested me. But the fascinating thing about all that commitment is I got a few months into my first practice after all the rigors of training. And I guess in the back of my mind, I thought maybe, somehow I was supposed to have arrived. And I remember, just in the midst of another day of chaos, just wondering, is this it? All that to end up here. And I really, that was many years ago, but ultimately helped me understand the focus on process, right? It's a journey. And, that commitment is there all along the way, but it's foolish to commit necessarily everything, all the eggs in your basket to an end point, because whenever you get there, there just has to be another end point somewhere farther away.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And that's a vital point that people have to understand what you just said. Basically, what you were saying was commit to the journey and not to the outcome, as Dr. Rao has said on a number of occasions. It's really about the journey, because when you get to the end point, you're like, is this it? But if you just understand it as a continuous journey, then you minimize those moments of, is this all that this is supposed to be? I thought there was more. By minimizing that journey, it allows us to continue that commitment to whatever we are involved in at that time. That takes me to, what does commitment look like for you? And that question really is for everyone. What does commitment really look like for you? Because oftentimes people use the word commitment, but I don't know if they've ever examined it or painted the picture of what it looks like, because too many people get into too many things and they let them fall by the wayside. Commitment, right? I can tell you my journey with working out and eating healthy, and I'm committed, and then all of a sudden I see those chicken wings. And for some reason, I uncommit for about 30 minutes and I recommit after I eat them, right? So what does commitment look like?
Yeah, breaks in the journey are probably okay, by the way, especially when it revolves around chicken wings.
That's right.
But, the commitment piece to me, and you might imagine it based on my background, right? Like, it always involves doing the homework. And when I was younger and still evolving faster in my journey, I think I'm evolving now. Maybe not as fast. Sometimes faster. It kind of comes and goes. But, sort of setting out some possible futures that are less clear, but some very clear next steps. And then doing the homework to understand the whole context. And beyond that is keeping my eyes open, because it's like that old saying, don't fall in love with one thing so much that you are willing to forego something that's better. And we get through this whole process a lot of times like we've described, and you end up at the end, or what you think was going to be the end. And there's this moment of pause, right? And it doesn't matter, like, it happens a lot of times. Like, I've run a number of marathons, none very fast, but you get after the race, if you don't sort of have in mind something else pretty quick, you're unstable. And the same thing happens in your career and in your education and in relationships. A lot of times it really comes down to something we've talked about in previous episodes, is curiosity, right? So as you're going through this journey, whatever it is, keeping your eyes open for new things, right? Don't be so blinded by whatever it is you're pursuing that you lose the context of your surroundings. And to me, that's really important. The commitment, to me, also needs to include a willingness to change if the evidence comes to support that a change is needed. So, that's why it's important to focus on the journey rather than the outcome. And I see this done wrong in a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, where they set goals, and a lot of times maybe they tie incentive compensation to it. And as soon as that happens, they're locked in on an outcome. A lot of times that outcome is set lower than what they know they can obtain because it's tied to compensation. And the willingness to change is compromised heavily. So one of the worst things, and we know from leadership, a fundamental lesson is the worst thing you can do is do the wrong work well. Well, if you set the wrong goal and you're focused only on the outcome, your process shows you that maybe a change is indicated, but you're so connected to that goal that you're reluctant to change, then that's really the wrong work.
Yep.
So we should try very hard not to become too focused on purely the outcome.
Absolutely. I'm going to go right back to what Dr. Rouse says. Our friend Dr. Rouse says that we must be committed to the journey, not the outcome. Actually, when we begin to talk about leadership and he begins to talk about goals, he says it's okay to set a goal, but once you set the goals, throw them out the window. Forget all about them. Use them as a framework, right? Something to look toward. However, it's really about the journey and the process of how do we really get there, committing really and truly to the journey. You know, I looked up something about commitment as we were getting ready to air this show, or record this show. And as I look up this article called Sense of Commitment, you know, the first sentence really struck me. And the first sentence says, the phenomenon of commitment is a cornerstone of human social life. And I was like, wow. So commitment is the cornerstone of our lives. I wonder how many people really consider that on a day-to-day basis, as many people are on autopilot, as we know. How many people really sit back and think about commitment being the cornerstone of everything that they do, whether they're doing it well, whether they're not doing it well? Again, commitment is something that you're either in or you're out. But how many people really think about that on a conscious level on a day-to-day basis?
Fascinating way to think of it, because you think of some of maybe our most traditional commitments that people think of: raising a child, right? Husband and wife, however you define that, best friends, you know, the commitment we have to an organization, like maybe it's our undergraduate institution, right? There's always a commitment there that transcends, and it's such a fascinating construct, right? Is that social bond. And as we think about that, it makes me think, well, so what happens when it's missing? When the bonds are inadequate, maybe it's across groups. If the bonds are inadequate across groups, if we don't feel that same sense of dedication to folks different than us, what does that mean?
You know, that's interesting that you say that. It's interesting that you brought up organizations and people's commitments to organizations, right? Because we know that from leadership and from management, people are committed to organizations, but if management doesn't treat them right, they're willing to leave their manager, even though they may have a commitment to the organization. And then there are other people within organizations who are solely committed to themselves and their career, right? It's more about them than it is about the organization. And with commitment being a word that we use all the time, I often wonder, if you ask someone the definition of commitment, what definition would you get from them, right? As I looked at this article, it said that commitment makes individuals' behavior predictable in the face of fluctuations in their desires and interests, thereby facilitating the planning and coordination of joint actions involving multiple agents.
That sounds so much like hours spent together working on this topic of, arriving at a decision, aligning behind that decision, and fully committing as a team.
Yes.
And you see that in athletics. It is blatantly obvious when it's not the case. You see it in corporations, you see it in healthcare organizations, any organization, you absolutely see it when it's absent. It pops out all kinds of different ways. And it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hard work that sometimes doesn't get done, because it gives the illusion of winners and losers, right? Because if we're in a group of 6, 7, 8, 9 people and we're trying to solve a problem or determine a direction, and we all have a sort of a different perspective because we've got a diverse group, another topic we've covered, right? Makes us better. We all see the world a little bit differently, and we have to ultimately work through the sloppiness of that, pick the next logical step, which is, in my experience, where it commonly goes awry, right? Because we're trying to say where we're going to end up sometimes too far out, right? And we tie it into all kinds of cool terms like strategic plan, or 5-year, whatever, and really we're in this group. So we've had all these different perspectives, but we have to decide and commit about where we're going next as an organization, because we're going to lead this organization. That's the hardest part, right? And you get a lot of counterfeit in that, right? The absence of commitment shows itself in malproductive ways, maladaptive ways, right? Because each person then leaves that group having said they committed, goes back to their particular lane or line of responsibility. And no matter who you are, if you're not careful, you slip right back into your way or my way. And that fails to honor the commitment. So it brings us back to where you started. Are you half in or half out?
You know, I was watching ESPN the other morning. I was watching some highlights, and I happened to see the Lakers and their new team. And there was a time where I think there was a foul committed, and one of the newer Lakers was trying to gather the other 4 Lakers to huddle right at the foul line to discuss, I guess, what the next strategy was going to be, the next play was going to be. And 4 of the Lakers met at that foul line, but there was one who didn't want to meet at the foul line, and he didn't. And so I had to ask myself, is he really committed to the Lakers? And is he committed to himself being the best player that he can be? Is he committed to wanting to be on the team? Is he committed to wanting to be a team player? Because based upon his actions, he wasn't. And as you've just mentioned, commitment, it's inclusion in commitment. Because I realize in my commitment that it's bigger than me. It's really about we, and we've talked about this in previous episodes. And so as I saw his actions, I questioned his commitment. And he's been on other teams, and I've questioned his commitment outside of himself, producing numbers, because he doesn't have a championship yet. And he appears to have been somewhat of a, and I don't like to use this word, a cancer to every team that he's been on. And then I saw that just the other day, and I'm like, this guy is not committed to anything but himself. So he's all in, but he's all in about him and not about the team. And we've seen that in organizations as well.
Absolutely. And, it kind of, commitment really is to people.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then people collectively, unless an individual, if it's just an individual goal, that's different. But when we're really trying to do big things,
yes,
it usually takes more than one person, right? Those people committing together is what it's all about. But that first commitment is to the other people, right? And I think of it, the simple analogy I think of in that case is, that's a new Laker, right? And think of that as a child in that organization, right? Maybe it's as simple as that new Laker has a question. Everybody else may not have that same question. They may know exactly what to do. But that commitment is to the people. And if it was a child and they had a question, that sense of commitment would lead people to come around and help give an answer, help show a way forward. And that's really how it kind of works, is that it's the commitment to people. And if any member of the group has a question, has a time of uncertainty, or needs help, you know, some of the most successful people in leadership, Alan Mullally comes to mind, right? Is that setting up that meeting with all his top executives every week, was a big part of that was to make sure that each person heard what the other was up against, so that if help was needed, it would be offered, and the collective would move to a better place.
Absolutely. And that's what it's all about, as you said, the collective, right? I'm a huge sports fan. So as yesterday, I'm looking at a football game, and I'm looking at one particular player with the Philadelphia Eagles. And as I look at him, he's a quarterback, right? Jalen Hurts. And I remember him in Alabama. I remember when he first came into the NFL. And he's a totally different quarterback this year than he's been in previous years. But that speaks to his commitment in the offseason to prepare to be the best quarterback that he could be. The physical workout, the mental workouts. As this definition alluded to, in the face of fluctuations, you become predictable. So he began to study situations and how he would respond in situations. He was committed to himself becoming better so that he could make the collective better as a Philadelphia Eagle. And now you're seeing the fruit of the work. But when they interview him at the end of games, he always talks about the commitment of the team and the commitment to the process and the journey.
That's such a great example of considering the other people, because his preparation involves knowing where everybody is going to be on the field. And as a quarterback, you know, that's putting the ball where it needs to be so that not only can the receiver catch it, they can do something with it.
Yes.
Right. And they're not going to get hurt based on how they have to try and catch it. So it's all those things of figuring out how it comes together. And that whole thing, I love to differentiate between team and individual commitment, because it means such different things, right? Like we all have personal growth goals or things that we like to do. Those can't get in the way of what is happening on your team, whether that's a sports team, whether that's a business, whether that's a healthcare organization or team. There's no conflict between the individual getting better and the team getting better, as long as we take the time to set the full context of what that means.
Yep, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And we probably need to look at that from a political perspective, right? Whether Democrat, whether Republican, whether independent, we need politicians who make a commitment to making this country better and opportunities better. And when we look at politicians, we question their commitment to the people or their commitment to themselves. And most of them fall in that category. But this topic of commitment is one that we could go on and on about, because it's just that important, right? As this says, it is the cornerstone of human social life. And every day we come to an intersection of commitment, what we're going to commit to or not. Regularly, I think everything that we do is really about if we're going to commit to an act or not. And it's interesting because along with commitment comes trust.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the P word, so I got to weigh in a little bit on political side, because I think one of the things that's really missing now is commitment to the common good. And what we see instead, which is a very poor substitute, is a commitment to constituents.
Yes.
Right? And at some level, we got to reconcile, right? We really do have to be willing to take a look, which leads to compromise and leads to solution making that is not polarized out on, far right and left ends of the spectrum. It's just where we ultimately have to go, but right now it's so profoundly unpopular. I think there's a homework issue there, personally, amongst the population. I think the vast majority of people right now are not doing the homework to understand the issues and how everything ultimately comes together to fundamentally work in our country and in our government. So to me, I would issue a challenge to everybody to spend a little more time, right? Like one of the things that we talk about all the time is implicit bias and how we individually see the world, right? There's an illusion that exists for me that, what I see is the way it is.
Right.
I saw it.
That's right. That's
But
right.
turns out I've got to reconcile it with what you saw,
That's right.
which is different, which is equally real,
That's right.
and what lots of other people see, because the reality is different, right? It is different than what any of us sees. It's somewhere in the middle, and we seem to have lost that concept in how we govern, and it just becomes polarized and it's nasty. But you mentioned trust, and trust is always one of my favorite topics because I think everything flows from that. If we don't have trust, and trust means a lot of different things, it means something individually, it means something corporately, it means something in a team. I think we've talked about it in the past that, part of trust is predictability, right? We trust people because we know how they're going to act in a given situation. If it's a sports team, you trust that the person is going to end up in a spot. That's why you see these people that, have an assist that nobody, you're playing a game and all of a sudden this guy passes to what looks like nowhere, but a guy catches it out of nowhere. And it was because they had a trust that the one person knew how the other person was going to act in a given situation. That's fundamental to commitment.
It is. It is fundamental to commitment. Some people are fearful of commitment. And now that we're having this conversation, I'm really trying to figure out, how does one walk through life with a fear of commitment when everything that you do requires commitment, whether it's getting out of bed in the morning, whether it's walking into your living room in the morning, getting in your car. All of that requires a measure of commitment. We don't think about it that way because we don't think about commitment. We always think about some big event that we have to commit to or some big activity. But when we think about it, really think about it, everything that we do in life requires some measure of commitment. And my question is, how do we raise that to a very conscious level of what commitment actually is for people to be able to see and understand what commitment really means?
Yeah, it starts with the baby steps of commitment, right? Like, and I'll use exercise as an example. So one of the things that we know is a lot of highly successful people exercise in the morning. They have a commitment to their own well-being, and they have to put certain structures in place in order to honor that, right? Like, it's not just a willpower thing. That hardly ever works for anybody, no matter how willful they are.
That's right. That's right.
But take working out, one of the key things that can happen is the homework for a morning workout is put out the stuff you need the night before.
That's right.
Put it in a place where you can see it when you first wake up. It gives you a little message that says, hey, remember what we were going to do, and it begins to set the stage step by step of that commitment to do something that's along your journey that you know is good for you. Now, it may change. You know, you may have I can't tell you how many times when I was running marathons and I'd get all that stuff on, go outside, pouring down rain, might have to call the audible, right? Like, do something different. Either add more clothes and do it anyway, or more commonly, figure out some kind of cross-training thing and do that anyway. But by that point, I'm already dressed.
That's right.
And it's like, okay, we got to do something.
Right.
And that structural piece of commitment that really is a preparation phase for me has always been helpful. And I know for some others too.
Yep. I just heard you describe commitment to the process of, you know, getting in shape, staying in shape, having a regimen of a healthy regimen of working out. It's really about that whole process, committing to the process, laying out your clothes, waking up at a particular time, knowing that, okay, the weather is not favorable, but there's something that I still have to do because I'm already dressed in order for me to maintain that health. So I'm listening to the commitment to the process, the commitment to the journey, which is, again, it goes right back to what this says, predictable in the face of fluctuations, right? And so it's about the journey, committed to the journey. And you mentioned structure and you mentioned process. And I always like to say structure and process creates discipline, right? That discipline, and that discipline means, to me, discipline is synonymous to commitment, right? I'm committed to doing this. I'm disciplined enough to do this, but I think there needs to be more conversation around this whole topic of commitment so that people truly understand the importance that it has in our everyday life, and sometimes we have a tendency to play it down.
So true. And one of the things that I think is important to bring into the discussion is, especially in a team context or group context, is what happens when you fail on your commitment, right? Like, let's say, you know, you were counting on me to do something. I gave it my best effort, but it just didn't happen. And we know that that's not uncommon, right? Especially if we're trying to do great things and hit high targets. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And it's really a breakdown, right? Like, it's a breakdown. And one of the things I think is important to bring into the discussion is that breakdowns are inevitable.
Yes.
And the sooner we call out that breakdown, the better off we are, because we can regroup and figure out what the new next step in the process is. And so one of the things that I always try to get groups to do is get comfortable with calling out the breakdown, whether it's your breakdown or whether you sense a breakdown, because a lot of times in a group dynamic, the outside eyes from another team member can pick up the breakdown happening before the person who's really being counted on to deliver it can pick it up.
That's right.
And so you're just much better off if you create that environment. Now, we see it in sports all the time, right? Like, it's the whole concept of helping out on defense in basketball.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And it's a help and recover, right? So you help out, and then the paradigm is either get back to your man or you switch, or whichever way that, again, there's a structure that tells you which way that's supposed to go for a given situation. But that concept is really important. So the communication around commitment has to be continuous on a team, in any group, so that you can adjust, because the energy of the universe does funny things, right?
Yes,
and no matter what you're trying to do,
that's right. That's right.
there are times where it just doesn't work out quite like you had planned, and the quicker we can get that into dialogue and figure out what's the next way to go, the better we are as a group.
That's right. I like to say we always have to get back on the horse. You know, anytime you've been kicked off the horse, you always have to get back on the horse, right? That's how we learn, right? What we've learned in the breakdown is how not to do something, right? But if I'm committed to the process, and ultimately I'm committed to learning what needs to be done, regardless of what the learning moments may be, which I consider learning moments, you know, rather than breakdowns. what were the learning moments that enabled me to be able to achieve the commitment that I set out to within the process of being committed to whatever that activity is. But this is an interesting topic because in this conversation alone, it's where it hit me that everything is a commitment.
It is 100%. And some of them are minor and some of them are major. But let's pivot and say, what happens when a commitment is inadequate, right? And I kind of call that recipe for regret, right? You set yourself up for somewhere down the road to say, if only I had, or what if I had, or why didn't I? You know, and it typically ends up, not that we all haven't done it,
Right.
right?
We
We have, right?
We
You're like, it's that big what if, and it almost always goes back to, what if I'd really put myself out there? What if I had really done my best?
Right.
And when we do that examination through the rearview mirror, why didn't I do my best that time? And for me, you know, a lot of times it was fear of failure. You know, like especially younger, it was always important to me to be successful and look successful, and you know, to not appear to struggle very much. And sometimes, and as a surgeon, that's actually pretty important too, right? Because you know, no matter how hard it is, as the leader in that room, you definitely need to have a cool head. Bad things happen when that doesn't exist. And so for me, it was a real journey to understand, you know, full commitment means doing your very best all the time, even if there's a possibility that you may experience failure. And the older I get and more experienced, the more I realize that those failures happen all the time. You can call them breakdowns, you can call them learning moments, you can call them opportunities.
Right.
I mean, you know, that's what, you
That's
know, that's
right.
the old joke amongst surgeons is, you know, in when we have the big healthcare meetings and stuff, we call them opportunities. Amongst surgeons, you know, we call them screw ups, right? Basically, and it really is a process of imperfection that you know that has imperfection has nothing to do with it, because imperfection is the expectation, whereas perfection is the aspiration.
Right.
And
That's
they're
right.
you know, it's like Lombardi. You shoot for perfection, and you know you'll hit excellent.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. That's right. That's right. You know, such an interesting topic, especially when we start talking about self-commitment and interpersonal commitment and the difference between the two, but then how they actually overlap. As I commit to myself, somewhere down the line, that commitment to myself will have an impact on the collective.
Absolutely. And, you know, my favorite example of this one is in Mike Krzyzewski's book, The Gold Standard. And, you know, at that time that the U.S. had been down in basketball and had not won the gold medal, and they brought that team back. And that book talks about a couple different concepts. It talks about the difference between context and perspective. And it talks about the name on the front of the jersey versus the name on the back of the jersey, which is one of my favorite metaphors, right? All my teams that I deal with in the healthcare arena, I always try to, don't always get it, I'm sure, but I always try to express to everybody, we want your best self. We want your great individual ideas. We want you to play your best, basically, right? And that's the context. But the bigger picture is perspective, right? And Mike Krzyzewski does a really interesting thing with that team that ended up winning the gold medal in 2012. Is he set the perspective as the United States of America. And very early on in that team's journey, he brought in a wounded veteran, amputee, to speak to the group and sort of really set the stage that, hey, as great as you all are, and they're the greatest basketball players in the world. I mean, LeBron, Dwayne Wade, he was hurt, he was back, Kobe, all these guys. And, as great as you are, and we want you playing your absolute individual best, this is really about the USA recapturing the world stage in basketball and demonstrating to the world that we are the very best at basketball, individually, but particularly collectively. And I think that's that's commitment.
Yeah, that's
when you commit to the common good, that's commitment.
Exactly. You can't get past this phrase is what it says. It is no man is an island, right? Whether we believe it or not, as we walk around as individuals, whatever we do has an impact on someone else. And as we walk through this life and we think about commitment, what is my commitment to my fellow human being? Something came to my head here as I was listening to you, and I was thinking about a commitment contract, right? For one to really give some thought to commitment, what are they really committed to? When you go into an organization signing a commitment contract, what are you really committed to with this organization? Whether you're a part of a social club, what are you really committed to as a part of this social club that I'm a part of? Because too many people walk through life without any commitments. At least it appears that they don't have any commitments, right? Based upon some of the things that we see. And so if they were asked that question, if they had to sign a commitment contract, what would they commit to up front?
What a brilliant question. And I think of it in the sense of the doctor-patient covenant, right? That bond. And I think we get that wrong a lot now, unfortunately, right? Because there's a communication barrier there sometimes. And while it starts with a good bond of trust and really trying to seek empathy and listen well, sometimes there's a miss there because it's different languages. But the real covenant, doctor-patient, would be something along the lines of, I'm going to understand what you as the patient need. I'm going to explain to you what our options are to get there. And together we're going to co-create a journey to start on it. And too often we miss that, and it's mostly a translational gap. But you mentioned earlier freedom, and I think that really made me think of my mother, because one of the things she taught us from a very young age, I had a brother that was 2 years younger than I am, sister much younger, but my brother and I, sort of needed some instruction from time to time on each other's personal space and things like that. And the thing was that my freedom had to end where my brother's nose began when it came to swinging my arms, right? And we get that now. There's this weird belief that freedom is unlimited in our country for a given individual. And that ignores the very foundational premise of the common good. And we absolutely have to understand that freedom is, while we always hear freedom isn't free, and it's not, but it's not unlimited either.
That's right.
And it really has to take into consideration the needs and the rights of others. And to the extent that we get that wrong, it ultimately has horrible effects on our ability to make progress as a society.
I agree. A big question for us, as a country, is what are we really committed to? Because there's so many agendas out there. What is that common commitment that we need to have to become a better country? And that's a question for an organization as well. What are the common commitments in order to be able to serve our constituency, our consumer, our patients, right? What are those common commitments we need to make? And what prevents us from making those commitments? Because there are always some constraints that exist. And oftentimes, things don't go as we want them to go. And so what went awry with that commitment that caused that deviation? Maybe this is a conversation that is had during a strategic planning process, but I'm willing to bet that it doesn't happen on a regular day-to-day basis around the question of commitment. If I'm a healthcare worker and I'm working in a particular department, do I ask myself on a day-to-day basis, am I truly committed to the patient? Or am I committed to my coworker? Am I committed to being the best that I can be? I'm sure that those questions probably don't arise consciously on a day-to-day basis. Often they will arise during an evaluation, from your manager, right? But it needs to be a day-to-day type of conversation around what the commitment is, because that leads us to the greater good of the organization, the greater good of society. And how do we get to that collective commitment?
Well, that's such a great question, and it really takes me back to NASA in the Kennedy era, right? And there was no question that manned space flight, that putting a person on the moon was critical, and it was in the context of Russian relations and all these things. But what made it work so well was clarity of purpose. And the story that we always tell, I've heard you tell it, I know I've told it many times, lots of people tell it, is, a person touring NASA and the custodian cleaning up, and they asked him what he was doing, and he says, I'm putting a man on the moon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that takes some real clarity, that takes effort to get an organization there. In a sense, it's really the holy grail of commitment. What has to happen to get there is that struggle, that difficult dialogue, especially now because we have such a diverse country. That difficult dialogue of what really is the set of principles we can align on. What are we going to do? Doesn't matter whether you're a government, a team, an organization of any kind. It's that difficult conversation, which you can't have when people are threatening one another. You can't have unless you create a space of openness in your mind, and unless you collectively up front say, we're going to work through this, we're going to work it all the way through, we're going to find the next viable step, and then we are going to make sure that we make it, and we're all going to work together to do that. Right. That's to me, that's the biggest obstacle to commitment, is the alignment component, which requires difficult discussions. It requires bringing different perspectives together and figuring out what the best compromise is. The thing that I've always been incredibly impressed by, though, is that when you actually do that, what you thought was going to be a compromise solution is quite often a much better solution than what anybody was proposing in the first place.
Right. I agree with
you.
you.
The leap of faith has to be taken.
That's right. I was listening to you, and I was just thinking about how many times people use the word commitment on a daily basis. I don't think people use that word a lot. And I think if we made it a more regular word in our conversation, a lot of those types of commitments would take care of themselves, and people would become more committed. Instead of saying we're gonna do this, no, we're committed to doing this. That's a different way of saying it. We're committed versus we're going to do it. No, we are committed to making this happen, right? The emotions that become involved, the alignment, as you mentioned, that happens as a result of we are committed. So that means that everybody's on the same sheet of music around being committed to make something happen, right? And then you find those who are not committed, right? They will fall off very, very, very quickly. And as they fall off because they're not committed, then you lose the trust. So there's so much in that equation around trust and commitment that happens because of or because something doesn't happen. And I really don't think, from a cerebral perspective, we really give that a whole lot of consideration.
Well, the tough thing that also happens is that when it becomes evident that somebody has abandoned their commitment in an organization or a team, really what that means is they've decided they don't want to be part of that team.
That's right.
And an action is necessary to sometimes remove them from that team, and that's hard leadership work. Sometimes that's tough to do and doesn't get done. But the idea is to have that critical mass of people that are truly committed, in my opinion, to doing what you're going to do. Which reminds me, we committed to another Unlikely Intersection show. I think we have done it, and I'd love to thank the audience for listening and ask you to check us out at unlikelyintersection.com or check me out on LinkedIn at Doc Phillip Brown or Terry.
Yep, you can find me on LinkedIn at Terry Jackson, PhD. We look forward to engaging with you. We look forward to answering any questions you may have or any suggestions you may have for Unlikely Intersection.
We'll see you at the next Unlikely